Normandy, France, July 1944. The air does not move. It is a thick, green, living thing, heavy with the scent of wet soil, cow manure, and sweet, rotting apples from 1,000 shattered orchards. The silence is the worst part. It is not a peaceful silence. It is a held breath, a predator silence. It presses in on the ears, a physical weight that promises violence. This is the bocage. In English, they call it hedgerow country. But that word hedgerow is a lie. It is a gentle, manicured word for a thing that is neither gentle nor manicured. It conjures images of English gardens and trimmed privet. The reality is a fortress. A squad from the 29th Infantry Division, the blue and gray, is crouched behind one of these things. They are not hedges. They are walls. 10-foot-high ramparts of earth, packed hard over centuries, bound by the gnarled, interlocking roots of ancient hawthorn and oak. They are green monsters, impenetrable to tanks, impervious to mortars, and they have turned this corner of France into a labyrinth of death. A young lieutenant, his face a pale mask of sweat and grime, gives a hand signal. 2 fingers, forward, go. The men do not want to go. They are no longer the confident boys who stormed Omaha Beach a month ago. They are old men in young bodies. Their movements are slow, weary, a strange mix of profound exhaustion and hair-trigger alertness. They are moving into a small pasture, no more than 50 yards across. It looks empty, deceptively, beautifully, murderously empty. A single crippled Charolais cow lies on its side, its legs stiffed in the air, its belly swollen. Flies swarm its glassy eyes. The first 3 men slip over the top of the earth bank. They land in the field with a soft thud. They fan out, rifles at the ready, their eyes scanning the far hedgerow. It is a solid wall of green, identical to the one they just left. It is silent. It is watching. The lieutenant follows, then the bar gunner, a heavy man who moves with a pained, rolling gait. He sets up his Browning automatic rifle, sinking the bipod into the soft turf. He is the anchor of their pathetic little assault. The sound, when it comes, is not a single gunshot. It is an explosion of noise, a mechanical, ripping snarl that seems to come from everywhere at once. It is the sound of an MG-42 machine gun, Hitler's buzzsaw, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound alone is a weapon. It tears at the nerves, a physical assault that makes men forget their training. The grass in front of the 3 lead riflemen vaporizes. Not cut, not kicked up. It simply vanishes in a blur of green confetti. The men are thrown backwards as if punched by an invisible giant. They do not scream. The impacts are too sudden, too total. They are dead before their helmets hit the ground. Then, a sharp, metallic crack thump. A Panzerfaust, a disposable, shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon. But the Germans are not using it on tanks. They are using it on men. A geyser of black earth and red mist erupts where the bar gunner was setting up. The big man is gone. The world's most powerful automatic rifle is a twisted piece of scrap metal. The lieutenant is screaming something. It is not an order. It is just a sound of pure animal panic. He is firing his carbine blindly into the wall of green across the field. His shots are answered by the sharp, distinct crack of Mauser rifles. Not a volley. Precise, individual shots. A marksman somewhere in that leafy wall puts a single round through the lieutenant's throat. He falls, gurgling, his hands clutching at the hole. The rest of the squad, the men still behind the relative safety of the hedgerow, do not move. They are pinned by a ghost. They are being systematically dismantled by an enemy they cannot see, cannot locate, and cannot fight. This is the established doctrine: advance across the field. It is the official solution to the impossible problem of the bocage, and it is a suicide pact written in mud and blood. This is the story we think we know. The story of a brutal, grinding war of attrition, where American lives were spent like currency to buy one muddy field at a time. It is the story of a superior army, with its endless supplies and air power, being bled white by a handful of determined defenders in a perfect defensive landscape. But this is not that story.
This is the story of how that perfect system was broken. It is the story of a commander who looked at the daily slaughter and saw not a tactical problem, but a psychological one. A man who understood that the Germans' greatest strength, their iron discipline and their mastery of the ambush, was also a flaw that could be exploited. This is the story of how one of the oldest tricks in the book, a feigned retreat, was twisted into a piece of lethal battlefield theater. This is the story of a fake surrender, a bluff so audacious, so contrary to the rules of war, that it tricked a perfect German ambush into destroying itself. To understand the bluff, you must first understand the cage. By early July 1944, the war in Europe had stalled. The Great Crusade, launched on the 6th of June with the largest amphibious invasion in human history, was in danger of becoming a bloody stalemate. The Allies had won the beaches. They had poured over 1 million men and hundreds of thousands of vehicles onto the shores of France. On the maps at Supreme Headquarters, the bold arrows showed a confident push inland, a breakout, a race to Paris. But the men on the ground were not moving. They were trapped. The problem was the terrain. The planners in London had looked at aerial reconnaissance photos and seen a patchwork of green fields, quaint villages, and sleepy country lanes. They had seen farmland. What they failed to understand, what no map could ever convey, was the third dimension, the hedgerows.
For 1,000 years, the Norman farmers had marked their tiny plots of land by building these earthen dikes. Each year, they would clear the stones from their fields and pile them on the wall. They would throw their dead livestock, their rubbish, their lives onto these mounds. And from this rich, dark soil, trees and bushes and thorns would grow, their roots sinking deep, turning the loose earth into a living rampart as hard as concrete. The result was a landscape of claustrophobic green tunnels, 1 million tiny, interlocking fortresses. It was the most perfect defensive terrain in the world, and the German army, masters of the defensive war, were using it with lethal genius. The established Allied solution was a disaster. It was a doctrine designed for a different war, a war of open fields and rapid movements. Here, it was useless. American tanks, the mighty Shermans, were channeled down the sunken lanes, where a single German with a $10 Panzerfaust could kill one from above, turning the 40-ton machine into an oven for its crew. If the tanks tried to climb the hedgerows, they would expose their thin belly armor, another easy kill for the waiting anti-tank guns. Artillery, the American god of war, was impotent. Shells that would have annihilated a company in the open simply buried themselves in the thick, absorbent earth of the hedgerows, their explosions muffled, their shrapnel swallowed by the dense foliage. So it fell to the infantry, the PBI, the poor bloody infantry. Their job was to advance, on foot, from one field to the next. The official tactic was called fire and maneuver. One squad would lay down covering fire on the next hedgerow, while another squad dashed across the open ground. But you cannot fire at an enemy you cannot see. The Germans were invisible. They did not fire from the top of the hedgerows. They dug firing positions into the base. They tunneled communication trenches inside the massive earthworks. They created interlocking fields of fire with their MG-42s, sighting them at the corners of fields so they could enfilade or fire down the length of any attacking American line. They waited. They held their fire with inhuman discipline, letting the Americans get halfway across the field into the very center of the kill zone before opening up from 3 sides at once. This was the institutional arrogance of the Allied High Command. Men like General Omar Bradley, a calm, professorial man, looked at the mounting casualty lists and saw a failure of will. He and others at his level could not grasp the reality on the ground. They saw the 29th, the 4th, the 90th divisions all making agonizingly slow progress. They saw it as a lack of aggression. They pushed their subordinate commanders, who in turn pushed the captains and lieutenants, who in turn had to order their men to make the next suicidal dash across the next 50-yard field. The established solution was to pour more men into the meat grinder. It was a strategy of attrition that America, with its vast resources, could eventually win, but the cost was staggering. In the month after D-Day, the U.S. Army suffered over 60,000 casualties, more than in the entire Pacific War to that point. They were losing men faster than they could be replaced. The Normandy beachhead was becoming a butcher's bill, and the ticking clock was getting louder. The Germans were not sitting still. While the Allied infantry was bleeding in the Bocage, the elite German panzer divisions, the ones that had been held in reserve, were moving toward the front. The 2nd SS Panzer, the 116th Panzer, hardened veteran units with superior tanks and experienced commanders.
If they reached the lines in force and launched a coordinated counterattack, they could drive the Allies back into the sea. The entire invasion could fail. The Grand Allied plan was Operation Cobra,
A massive, concentrated aerial bombardment, using thousands of heavy bombers to blast a 2-mile-wide carpet of destruction through the German lines, creating a hole through which General George S. Patton's Third Army could pour, breaking out into the open country beyond. But Cobra could not be launched until the infantry had secured the jump-off points. They needed to take the key crossroads town of St. Lo, and St. Lo was on the other side of hundreds, thousands of these green, blood-soaked fields. The system was failing. The by-the-book tactics were getting men killed for no gain. The high command was blaming the soldiers for the failures of the strategy, and the German defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, were confident. They were snug in their earthen forts, their machine guns zeroed in on every gap, their Panzerfausts resting on the parapets. They knew the Americans would come. They knew they would come straight ahead, across the open ground. And they knew that when they did, they would die. The ambush was a perfect, unbeatable system. The system, however, had not accounted for a man who refused to play by the rules. A lieutenant colonel who was about to turn the Germans' perfect discipline into a weapon against them. He was about to stage a play, and the Germans were going to be his unwitting actors. The man who would solve the riddle of the hedgerows was not a celebrated infantry commander. He was not a grizzled veteran of the trenches, nor a brilliant young strategist from the halls of West Point. His name was John B. Madaris, and he was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army Ordnance Corps. He was, in the rigid caste system of the Army, a mechanic, a glorified quartermaster, a man who dealt in the cold, hard mathematics of supply and demand, of shell casings and spare parts. His job was to equip the war, not to fight it. The infantrymen, the real fighters, saw men like Madaris as staff officers, rear echelon remfs, men with clean uniforms and soft hands who did not understand the sharp end of the spear. They saw a man who counted bullets, not a man who dodged them. He was, in every meaningful way, an outsider. He did not have the credentials to devise a new infantry tactic. He did not have the combat experience. He did not speak their language of fire and maneuver. But John Madaris had a secret, a unique, on-the-ground perspective that no one else in the chain of command possessed. He did not think like a soldier, he thought like an engineer. And where the infantry commanders saw a landscape of green leafy death, Madaris saw a machine, a perfectly designed, brutally efficient German killing machine. And like any machine, he believed it could be understood, it could be reverse-engineered, and it could be broken. His job in Normandy was to liaise with the frontline units, to assess the performance of American weaponry in this new, brutal environment. He spent his days at the very edge of the battle, talking to the survivors. He crawled in the ditches and studied the after-action reports, not for their tactical lessons, but for their data. He was a forensic engineer of slaughter. He noted the angles of fire. He measured the depth of the kill zones. He counted the number of Panzerfausts expended per American tank destroyed. This was his eureka moment. It was not a flash of inspiration. It was the slow, dawning horror of a repeating pattern. He watched the attacks. He saw the same tactics used, again and again, with the same disastrous results. And he saw the German response. It was always the same. It was perfect, it was disciplined, it was, he realized, utterly predictable. The Germans were not fighting with chaotic fury. They were operating a system. The MG-42 would open fire only when the Americans reached a specific point in the field. The Panzerfaust gunner would fire only when the Sherman tank crested the hedgerow. The riflemen would hold their fire, picking their targets with calm precision, only after the machine gun had pinned the survivors. It was a symphony of death, conducted with the unthinking precision of a Swiss watch. He realized the terrible irony. The Americans were losing, not because the Germans were better fighters, but because they were more disciplined. Their greatest strength, their inhuman ability to wait, to hold their fire until the perfect moment, was the gear upon which their entire machine turned. This was his unique observation. What if, he thought, you did something the machine was not programmed to handle? What if you introduced a variable that the system had no protocol for? The German ambush was designed to do one thing: kill advancing soldiers. It was not designed to process a surrender. Surrender was a complex administrative act. It required the machine gun to cease fire. It required a squad leader to make a decision. It required men to leave their perfectly concealed fighting positions and expose themselves to take prisoners.
A surrender, offered at the height of a battle, in the middle of the kill zone, was a logical paradox. It was an error message, and it might, just might, be enough to make the machine crash. He took his idea to his immediate superiors, and then to the staff of the V Corps commander. It was a catastrophe. He was a logistician, an ordnance man, lecturing hardened infantry colonels on infantry tactics. The idea itself was met with a mixture of disbelief and outright disgust. A fake surrender? Sir, we are the United States Army. We do not engage in such cowardly trickery. It was ungentlemanly. It was a violation of the unwritten rules of combat. What if the Germans started doing the same thing? The established leadership did not just dismiss his idea, they were offended by it.
They saw it as a sign of weakness, a trickster's solution to a problem that required only more courage, more artillery, more American blood. Medeiros was told, in no uncertain terms, to go back to counting his beans and bullets and to leave the fighting to the fighters. The system had looked at his idea, a piece of psychological warfare in a war of brute force, and it had rejected it as heresy. This was the catalyst, the daily, grinding reports, the casualty figures that were not just numbers to him, but a measure of institutional failure. He would watch the fresh-faced replacements move up to the line in the morning, their eyes wide with a doomed, naive bravado. And he would see them in the evening, their bodies wrapped in muddy ponchos, stacked like cordwood on the back of a deuce-and-a-half truck. The doctrine was a failure. The experts were wrong. The system was broken. He was going to break the rules. He could not order a division to adopt his tactic. He had been laughed out of headquarters. But he was a lieutenant colonel. He had rank, and he had access. He began to search, not for a commander who would obey him, but for a commander who was as desperate as he was. He found him in a muddy command post dugout near St. Lo, a captain from the 29th Division, commanding a rifle company that had been bled white. The company had begun the Normandy campaign with over 200 men. It was now down to less than 60. The captain was a young man, but his eyes were ancient. He had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too many of his boys die for nothing. He had just been given his orders for the next day. Take the field codenamed Pasture 227. It was an order to commit suicide. Medeiros, the ordnance officer, the outsider, sat with the infantry captain. He did not give him an order. He gave him a pitch. He laid out his theory. He spoke of the German ambush not as an enemy, but as a machine. A predictable, flawed machine. He described his tactic, the bluff, the piece of theater. The captain listened. He was skeptical. It sounded like a movie plot. It sounded like a good way to get a man shot for no reason. But then he looked at the map. He looked at Pasture 227. He thought about the men he would have to order into that field tomorrow. The official doctrine was certain death. This crazy idea from a rear echelon colonel? It was only probable death. It was a chance. It was a gamble. He agreed. They would conduct an unauthorized test. A secret. A conspiracy between a staff officer with a crazy idea and a line captain with nothing left to lose. This was the new tactic. The fake surrender. It was battlefield theater in 4 acts. Act 1. The bait. The next morning, under a sky the color of lead, a single squad from the captain's company began the assault on Pasture 227. It looked like every other attack. 9 men moving in a staggered line, their rifles held at the high port. They moved out into the 50 yards of open, deadly ground. They were the bait. They were the sacrificial lambs offered up to the German machine. Halfway across, the machine responded. The snarl of an MG-42 erupted from a hidden position in the far hedgerow. The sound tore the air. Dirt kicked up around the GI's boots. As planned, the squad dove for cover, hitting the dirt, crawling for any shallow depression they could find. They began firing back, their shots wild, unaimed, a performance of desperate, ineffective resistance. They were pinned. To the unseen Germans, everything was proceeding according to the script. Act 2. The Bluff. After 2 long minutes of this hopeless exchange of fire, one of the American soldiers, a private chosen for his nerve, ceased firing. He took a piece of white cloth, actually a strip torn from his own t-shirt, and tied it to the bayonet of his M1 rifle. Slowly, agonizingly, he got to his knees. He raised the rifle in the air. Then he stood up, his other hand raised high. He stood there, alone in the middle of the kill zone, a perfect, unmoving target. A silence fell. A heavy, profound silence. The MG-42 stopped firing. This was the moment of truth. This was the error message being fed into the German machine. A surrendering soldier. In the middle of a firefight, it was not in their manual. Act 3. The reveal. In the German position, there was confusion. The machine gunner looked at his squad leader, a hardened Feldwebel, a sergeant. The Feldwebel was suspicious. This could be a trick. But it could also be a surrender. His own doctrine, his iron discipline, demanded a certain procedure. He could not simply shoot a man with his hands up. He had orders. Prisoners were valuable for intelligence. He made a decision. He gestured to two of his riflemen. He rose from his concealed spire hole, his MP-40 submachine gun held at the ready, and he began to walk forward to take his prisoner. The two riflemen followed, emerging from their own camouflaged positions. For the first time, the Germans were visible. They had revealed themselves. They had exposed the location of their ambush. Act 4. The trap. The captain, watching through his binoculars from the American hedgerow, gave a single, quiet command into his field telephone. Fire. The bluff was over. The trap was sprung. Two American M1919 machine guns, carefully sighted at the flanks of the field, guns that had remained silent until this exact moment, opened up. Their fire was not a wild spray. It was a focused, murderous stream of tracer rounds, aimed not at the hedgerow in general, but at the precise coordinates of the now revealed German position. At the same time, a 60mm mortar team, their weapon pre-sighted on that exact same spot, dropped 3 rounds, one after the other. The effect was total. The German Feldwebel and his 2 riflemen vanished in a cloud of shrapnel and dirt. The mortar rounds landed directly in their nest, a hollow crump, crump, crump that threw bodies and equipment into the air. The MG-42 was silenced forever. The "it works." The American private, the one who had stood up to surrender, dove to the ground as the friendly fire erupted over his head. The rest of his squad, the bait, now became the assault element. They rose and ran the last 25 yards to the German hedgerow, firing from the hip. They found only silence. And death. The impossible had happened. Pasture 227 had been taken. The cost? 0 American lives. The perfect German ambush had not just been defeated, it had been dismantled, its own discipline used as a weapon to ensure its own destruction. The test was a success. The insane idea of the ordnance colonel was not insane. It was genius. The report from the captain of the 29th Division did not land on his regimental commander's desk as a triumph. It arrived as an anomaly, a statistical aberration that did not compute. A 50-yard pasture, one that had been projected to cost at least a dozen casualties, had been taken. The cost, according to the neatly typed after-action report, was 0. 0 Americans killed, 0 wounded, 8 Germans killed. The objective secured in under 30 minutes. The colonel, a hard, exhausted man who had spent a month watching his regiment bleed to death one field at a time, read the report twice. It made no sense. It was a typo. It was a lie. Or it was a miracle. He summoned the captain. The captain, still buzzing from the impossible victory, explained what had happened. He did not mention Madaris. He spoke of a new field tactic, a feigned surrender to draw the enemy's fire. He expected a commendation, perhaps even a promotion. Instead, the colonel's face, already a mask of grim fatigue, darkened into a storm cloud of pure fury. He did not see a brilliant tactic. He saw a violation of everything he understood about war. He saw a trick. A cheap, dishonorable, and unspeakably dangerous piece of theatrics. He saw a captain who had, without authorization, gambled with the lives of his men on a stunt. Worse, he had gambled with the honor of the regiment. He dressed the captain down, his voice a low, venomous hiss in the confines of the damp command tent. He told him he was a fool. He told him that if word of this ever got out, the Germans would learn. They would never again accept a legitimate surrender. They would shoot every American who tried to give up, and that blood would be on the captain's hands. The tactic was not to be used again. The report was to be buried. But the story was too strange, too impossible to be completely contained. It leaked. Not as a report, but as a rumor, a whisper that traveled through the muddy communication trenches. The story of the ghost pasture. the field that had been taken for free. And the rumor had a name attached to it, not the captain's name, but the name of the strange ordnance officer who had been seen talking to him the night before the attack. Medeiros. The rumor traveled up the chain of command, where it finally solidified into a formal complaint. An infantry colonel, a man named McGregor, who commanded a neighboring regiment, heard the story and saw it not as a curiosity, but as a contagion, a dangerous, undisciplined idea that threatened to infect the fighting spirit of the entire army. He lodged a formal inquiry. This was the boardroom. It was a damp, hastily assembled tent at V Corps headquarters, the air thick with the smell of canvas, kerosene, and cold mud. Outside, a miserable Norman drizzle fell, drumming a steady, monotonous rhythm on the roof. Lieutenant Colonel John B. Medeiros, his Ordnance Corps insignia looking painfully out of place, stood before Colonel McGregor. McGregor was the system made flesh. He was a bull of a man with a thick neck and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the rain.
He was an infantryman, pure and simple. He had come up the hard way, and he believed in the hard truths of warfare. He believed in fire superiority. He believed in aggression. He believed that battles were won by the side that was willing to close with and destroy the enemy, to look him in the eye and kill him. This idea, this fake surrender, was anathema to him. It was the antithesis of everything he had ever learned. He did not invite Medeiros to sit. He let him stand there, a logistician in the temple of the warrior caste, and he began his sermon. He accused Medeiros of being an amateur, a staff officer, playing games with the lives of real soldiers. He called the tactic a parlor trick, a piece of cheap cunning that had no place in a real war. He said, "You are teaching men to raise a white flag, Colonel. You are putting the idea of surrender into their heads. We are trying to build fighters, men who will advance into the teeth of the enemy, and you are teaching them how to play act." This was the core of the institutional arrogance. It was a deep, profound, and fundamentally moral objection. McGregor saw the war not just as a tactical problem, but as a test of character. The American soldier was supposed to be brave, straightforward, even chivalrous in his own way. He was supposed to win by being tougher and stronger, not by being cleverer. This trickery, this felt German. It was the kind of thing the enemy would do. It was cowardly. He jabbed a thick finger at a copy of the Geneva Conventions lying on his field desk. He said, "This is a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the laws of war. It is perfidy. It is an abuse of the white flag. If we do this, we give the enemy every justification to do the same. We forfeit our moral high ground." Medeiros tried to argue. He spoke of the math. He spoke of the casualty rates. He spoke of the German machine and its predictability. "Sir," he said, "this is not about cowardice. It is about saving American lives. It is about using the enemy's own rigid discipline against him. It is a key to unlock the hedgerows." McGregor was unmoved. His eyes were cold, dead things. He saw Medeiros not as an innovator, but as a corrupting influence, a man of numbers and machines who did not understand the soul of an army. He gave him a direct order. "You will cease all discussion of this tactic. You are forbidden from communicating it to any line officer. You will return to your duties as an ordnance officer, and you will leave the fighting of this war to the infantry. The matter is closed." Medeiros was dismissed. He walked out of the tent into the gray, weeping afternoon, his mind reeling. The system had not just rejected his idea, it had condemned it. It had branded it as a moral failing, a crime against the warrior ethos. He had won the battle in Pasture 227, but he had lost the war in the command tent. The perfect test, the impossible success, had been for nothing. The doctrine was unchanged. The meat grinder would continue. This was the conflict. The engineer, the man who had seen the flaw in the enemy's machine, had been overruled by the priests of a failing religion. And all the while, the ticking clock was growing louder. The fight for the town of St. Lo had become a nightmare. The German resistance had hardened. Their defense centered on a series of low hills that dominated the approaches to the city. One of these was a place that had no name on the maps, just a number. Hill 192. Hill 192 was not a mountain. It was a gentle, unassuming slope, covered in pastures and apple orchards, crisscrossed by a dozen of the same monstrous hedgerows. But it was key terrain. From its crest, German observers could direct artillery fire onto 3 different American divisions. It had to be taken. And for 5 days, the American army had thrown itself at Hill 192. And for 5 days, the army had broken against it.
The Germans defending it were not standard infantry.
They were Fallschirmjäger, elite paratroopers. They were masters of camouflage and defense. They had turned the hill into a fortress of interlocking machine gun nests, hidden mortar pits, and pre-registered artillery kill zones. Entire American companies had charged up its slopes only to be scythed down, vanishing into the tall grass. The official doctrine, the fire and maneuver, the artillery barrages, the tank assaults had all failed. Hill 192 had become a symbol of the entire Normandy stalemate. It was a place of slaughter. This was the gamble. This was the moment where the rules had to be broken. The order to take Hill 192 fell to a new unit, a battalion of the 2nd Infantry Division, the Indian Head. The battalion commander was a major named Charles Gerhardt. He was a professional, a West Pointer, a man who followed orders. But he was not a fool. He had seen the reports from the units that had tried and failed. He knew the order he had been given was a death sentence for his battalion. He was being asked to feed his men into a wood chipper. Desperation is the mother of invention. Gerhardt had heard the rumor, the story of the ordnance colonel and the field that had been taken for free. He was a man drowning, and he was looking for anything to grab onto. He did something that could have ended his career. He went around the chain of command. He found Lieutenant Colonel John Medeiros. He found him in a supply depot, overseeing the unloading of jerry cans of gasoline, a man banished to the purgatory of logistics. Their meeting was not in a command tent. It was in the back of a canvas-topped truck, the two men sitting on crates of K-rations, their voices low, conspiratorial. Gerhardt laid out his problem, Hill 192. He had orders to attack at dawn, 2 days from now. The plan he had been given was the standard one, a frontal assault. He told Medeiros that he expected to lose half his battalion in the first hour. This was the advocate. The desperate man, the one with nothing to lose, who was willing to listen. He asked Medeiros about the tactic, not as a rumor, but as a real, viable plan. Medeiros, still stinging from his confrontation with McGregor, saw a spark of hope. Here was a man who was not blinded by dogma. Here was a man who cared more about his soldiers than about the unwritten rules of some imaginary warrior code. But he also had a direct order from a superior officer. He was forbidden to discuss his tactic. This was the damn the rules decision. To hell with McGregor. To hell with the system. He looked at Major Gerhardt, at the profound, weary desperation in the man's eyes, and he made his choice. He would risk a court-martial. He would risk his career, his rank, his entire future in the army, on the belief that he was right. He spent the next hour talking. He laid out the 4 acts of his battlefield play: the bait, the bluff, the reveal, the trap. But this would not be a single squad in a single pastor. Gerhardt's problem was a hill, a fortress. It would require an orchestra. They began to plan. It was a conspiracy, a secret war council held in the back of a truck. They would not use 1 squad. They would use 3, from 3 different companies, attacking 3 different, widely spaced points on the German lines simultaneously. 3 fake surrenders, timed to the second. They would not be supported by 2 machine guns. They would be supported by the entire battalion's heavy weapons company. Machine guns, heavy mortars, even anti-tank guns firing high explosive shells. Every weapon would be pre-sighted, not on the German hedgerows, but on the likely spots in front of the hedgerows, the places where the disciplined, predictable German squad leaders would have to walk to accept the surrender. It was a massive, complex piece of choreography, a gamble on an unprecedented scale. If it worked, it would not just take a field. It might crack the entire German line on Hill 192. It might save hundreds of American lives. If it failed, if the Germans did not fall for the trick, the 3 squads would be massacred, and Major Gerhardt and Lieutenant Colonel Medeiros would be finished. They would be remembered as the 2 fools who had tried to win a battle with a cheap trick, and who had gotten their men killed for nothing. As the rain fell outside, the 2 men, the logistician and the infantryman, the uncredentialed theorist and the desperate practitioner, shook hands. The gamble was on, the play was cast, the curtain would rise on Hill 192 at dawn. The dawn on Hill 192 arrived not as a light, but as a slow dilution of the darkness. A pearlescent gray mist clung to the ground, muffling sound, making the world feel small and airless. It was cold, a damp, bone-aching chill that seeped through wool uniforms and settled deep in the marrow. For the German paratroopers of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, this was perfect weather.
The mist provided concealment. The silence was their friend. It was a hunter's morning. In a deeply excavated fighting position near the crest of the hill, a Feldwebel named Erich Kessel checked the action on his MG42. He did it by feel, his movements economical and precise, the practiced ritual of a man who knew his weapon better than he knew his own wife's face. Kessel was a veteran of Crete and the Eastern Front. He was not an ideologue, he was a professional. And Hill 192, in his professional opinion, was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. His position, dug into the forward slope of an ancient hedgerow, was invisible from more than 10 feet away. It was connected by a narrow tunnel to a sleeping dugout and an ammunition store. He had a clear field of fire over the pasture below, a gentle, rising slope of wet grass that offered no cover at all. He and his men had spent weeks sighting their weapons, calculating ranges, turning this anonymous piece of Norman farmland into a calibrated killing floor.
He knew the Americans would come. They were unsubtle. They were loud. They attacked with a clumsy, brute force courage that he found both admirable and pathetic. They would come in the morning, after their customary and largely useless artillery barrage. They would come walking straight up the hill, as they had for the past 5 days, and they would die in the wet grass. He felt no hatred for them. He felt only a weary, professional contempt. They were amateurs, and this was a professional's war. He heard the distant, hollow crump of the American artillery beginning its morning hate. The shells were big, but they were inaccurate. Most of them screamed harmlessly overhead to explode somewhere behind the lines. A few landed on the hill, great fountains of mud and smoke. But the thick earth of the hedgerows swallowed the blasts, shaking the ground but leaving his position untouched. He and his men hunkered down, used to the noise, bored by its futility. When the barrage lifted, a new silence fell. This was the moment. Kessel peered through a narrow slit in the camouflage netting over his position. The mist was beginning to burn off. The field below was a ghostly, empty stage. He waited. He knew the American officers would be giving their orders, the NCOs kicking their men into motion. He could almost feel their fear, a scent on the wind. And then he saw them. 3 separate groups. Not a company, not even a platoon. Just small squads, moving far apart, as if they were trying to sneak past his flanks. It was a pathetic sight. They were moving slowly, cautiously, their rifles held high. They looked like boys on a hunting trip. Kessel smiled a thin, humorless smile. This was the arrogant advance of the enemy, an advance into a perfect trap. His orders to his gunner were simple. He told him to wait. He said, let them get to the center. Let them feel safe. The American squads advanced. They reached the halfway point of the field, the point of no return. Kessel gave a nod. His gunner squeezed the trigger. The MG42 exploded into life, its insane, ripping snarl shattering the morning. It was joined by 2 other German machine guns, one to his left, another far to his right, their fire converging to create an impenetrable wall of lead. The American squads instantly dove for cover, just as they always did. They hit the mud and began firing back, their M1 rifles making a pathetic popping sound against the overwhelming roar of the German guns. To Kessel, this was the familiar rhythm of the slaughter. The overture was over. Now came the slow, methodical destruction of the pinned infantry. Everything was proceeding according to the plan. The system was working. Then the system broke. From his position, Kessel saw the American squad directly in front of him stop firing. One man, a single soldier, got to his knees. He was fumbling with something, a piece of white cloth. He attached it to his rifle, and then he stood up. Kessel stared. He could not process the image. An American soldier was standing, fully exposed in the middle of the kill zone. His rifle was held high, the white flag flapping limply in the breeze. His other hand was raised. He was surrendering. Kessel's gunner stopped firing, his finger frozen on the trigger. He looked at Kessel, his face a mask of confusion. The entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Kessel's mind, a machine of tactical calculation, began to race. What was this? Was it a trick? Was the soldier a decoy? But for what? There was no cover for an attack. And then he saw it happen again. Far to his left, in the field being covered by the neighboring platoon, another white flag went up. Another American soldier standing alone in a field of fire. And then, to his right, a third.
This was not a surrender. This was a collapse. The entire American attack, all three prongs of it, was giving up simultaneously. Kessel felt a surge of triumphant contempt. The amateurs were breaking.
After only a few minutes of resistance, they were showing their true, cowardly colors. His training, his doctrine, the very core of his professional discipline now took over. He could not simply shoot them. They were prisoners. Prisoners meant intelligence. Prisoners meant the battle was won. He had to accept their surrender. He looked at his men. He pointed to two of them, gesturing for them to provide covering fire. He picked up his own weapon, an MP-40, and he did the one thing the American plan required him to do. He left his fortress. He rose from the safety of his dugout, stepping out from behind the hedgerow into the open. He felt a moment of naked vulnerability, but it was overshadowed by the imperative of his duty. He began to walk forward, down the slope, his weapon ready, his eyes fixed on the lone American soldier who stood waiting for him in the field. And as he walked, he saw that he was not alone. All along the German line, the same scene was playing out. Disciplined German NCOs, hardened paratroopers, were emerging from their holes, their weapons at the ready, walking forward to collect their prizes. They were drawn out by the irresistible bait, by the fundamental paradox of a surrender in the middle of a battle. They were moving, as Madaris had predicted, to the spots in front of their hedgerows. They were revealing themselves. The entire invisible fortress of Hill 192 was suddenly, fatally visible. Major Charles Gerhardt, watching from his observation post 1,000 yards away, felt his heart stop. It was working. The insane, beautiful, theatrical plan was working. Through his binoculars, he could see them. Little gray figures emerging from the green walls, stepping into the open. Not one or two. He counted 10, then 20, then more. They were like ants emerging from a disturbed nest. His 3 bait squads were still pinned in the fields. The 3 men with the white flags were still standing, a display of courage so profound it made his throat ache. They were the linchpins of the entire operation. He keyed the microphone on his field telephone. His voice was calm, steady, betraying none of the roaring triumph in his chest. To all heavy weapon stations, he said, "Execute." The word was not a shout, it was a release. It was the sound of the trap being sprung. The air did not explode, it was torn apart. From the American lines, a dozen M1919 heavy machine guns, weapons that had been painstakingly sighted and zeroed for this exact moment, opened up as one. Their fire was not aimed at the hedgerows, it was aimed at the figures in front of them. Streams of tracer fire, like red-hot lances, converged on the exposed German squads. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. Men who had been walking confidently one second were shredded the next, their bodies thrown backwards, ripped apart by the concentrated fire. Simultaneously, the battalion's 81 mm mortars, weapons that had been silent all morning, coughed their payloads into the sky. The bombs did not fall randomly. They fell with pinpoint precision on the coordinates that the German NCOs had just obligingly marked with their own bodies. The ground erupted in a series of deafening, concussive blasts, each one sending a geyser of black earth, green foliage, and gray uniform fragments into the air. For Erich Kessel, the world ended in a flash of understanding. One moment, he was walking toward his prisoner. The next, he heard the sudden, terrifying sound of a dozen heavy machine guns opening up, not at the soldier in front of him, but at him. He saw the man with the white flag dive to the ground. He saw the flashes on the American ridge. And in the last, crystalline second of his life, he understood the trick. He understood the genius of it. It was not a surrender. It was a trap. And his own discipline, his own professionalism, had been the key that had locked him inside it. He opened his mouth to scream a warning, but the sound was lost in the shriek of an incoming mortar round that landed 10 feet away and vaporized him. The validation was absolute. The German line, the impenetrable fortress that had bled the American army for 5 days, ceased to exist in 90 seconds of coordinated violence. The bait squads, their job done, now became the assault. They rose from the mud, the men with the white flags stuffing the cloths back into their pockets, and they charged. They did not charge into a hail of machine gun fire. They charged into a stunned, smoking silence. They reached the German hedgerows and found not a line of determined defenders, but a charnel house. The machine gun nests were craters filled with mangled bodies and twisted metal. The communication trenches had collapsed.
A few dazed, wounded survivors were stumbling around, their minds shattered by the sudden, incomprehensible violence. They surrendered immediately, their hands shaking, their eyes wide with the horror of what they had just witnessed. The bluff, the fake surrender, had been proven decisively in combat. Major Gerhardt's battalion took the forward slope of Hill 192, the position that had been deemed impregnable, in under 15 minutes. The cost was 3 men wounded. The enemy's perfect system had been turned against itself. Their discipline had been their undoing. Their mastery of the ambush had made them exquisitely vulnerable to a new kind of ambush, one that targeted not their bodies, but their minds. The news of the breakthrough was met, not with cheers, but with stunned disbelief at regimental headquarters. Colonel McGregor, the man who had condemned the tactic as cowardly and immoral, received the report that Gerhardt's battalion was on the crest of Hill 192. He refused to believe it. He got on the radio himself, his voice crackling with suspicion, demanding confirmation. Gerhardt's voice came back, calm and professional. He said the objective was taken, and he was awaiting orders to continue the advance. The tactic, the stupid trick of the ordnance colonel, had just broken the back of the German resistance at St. Lo. It had not just won a battle, it had validated a revolutionary new way of thinking about war. It had proven that the mind of the enemy was a target as vital as any bunker or machine gun nest. The play, conceived in the back of a truck, had been performed, and its closing act was a stunning, unbelievable victory. The news did not travel up the German chain of command as a report of a defeat. It arrived as a system crash, a stream of incomprehensible error messages. In the headquarters of the 2nd Parachute Corps, General Eugen Meindl, a man whose entire identity was forged in the elite, fanatical discipline of his Fallschirmjäger, stared at the reports from Hill 192. They were a tactical impossibility. A coordinated, battalion-level assault that had shattered his line in minutes with negligible American casualties. His staff officers, men who had mastered the intricate mathematics of defensive warfare, could offer no explanation. The initial reports from the few dazed survivors spoke of a mass surrender. An entire American battalion had laid down its arms. Then, in the next breath, they spoke of a sudden, annihilating firestorm. The two realities could not coexist. Meindl's universe, a world built on the bedrock principle of the superiority of the German fighting man, his iron will and unshakable discipline, was beginning to fracture. He was a professional looking at the wreckage of a perfect machine. He knew his men. They did not break. They did not panic. Yet an entire sector of his fortress, a position that had contemptuously devoured American attacks for 5 days, had evaporated. His intelligence officers began to piece together the truth, not from their own men, but from the chilling silence on the radio and the sudden, terrifying advance of the American line. It was a trick, a piece of psychological poison. The enemy had not used a new weapon. They had not used a new tank or a bigger bomb. They had used his men's own virtues against them. They had turned the Fallschirmjäger's discipline into the trigger of a trap. The Americans' feigned cowardice had been a lure, designed to draw his NCOs, his professionals, out into the open. It was a tactic so cynical, so contemptuous of the established rules of combat, that it baffled him. It was not a frontal assault. It was a piece of intellectual sabotage. The German reaction was not to copy the tactic. It was to build a firewall against it. An order was drafted, disseminated with frantic urgency to every unit on the Normandy front. It was a warning. American soldiers attempting to surrender in the midst of an attack were not to be trusted. They were to be considered decoys. They were to be shot. Colonel McGregor's greatest fear had come to pass. The moral high ground he had been so desperate to protect was now, officially, a minefield. But what he had seen as a potential crime, the German command saw as a symptom of a stunningly effective new weapon. They had been beaten, not by American courage, but by American cunning. The order was a backhanded compliment. It was an admission, written in the cold, hard language of German military bureaucracy, that the bluff had worked. The perfect system had been forced to issue a patch to correct a fatal flaw that, until that morning, it had not even known existed. And what of the architect of this chaos? What of the quiet life of the hero? John B. Madaris did not have a quiet life. He was not the kind of man who returns to a small town to run a hardware store. He was an engineer of systems, and the war was simply the most complex system he had yet encountered. He did not receive the Medal of Honor for Hill 192.
His contribution was too strange, too cerebral, too far outside the traditional definitions of battlefield valor. It was a victory of the mind, and the army was in the business of awarding medals for victories of the body. He remained an ordnance officer, a brilliant but eccentric logistician who had, for one brief, bloody moment in France, changed the course of a battle with a thought experiment. He finished the war, but his war with complex systems was just beginning. He stayed in the army, a man who saw the world not as a collection of people and places, but as a series of interlocking machines. He saw the Cold War not as an ideological struggle, but as an engineering problem. And he found a new machine to master, a machine of unimaginable power and complexity: the ballistic missile. In the 1950s, Major General John Medeiros was given command of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency at Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. The man who had been told to go back to counting bullets was now in charge of building the most powerful weapons on Earth. He was the man who had reverse-engineered a German ambush in the Bocage. Now, his job was to harness the genius of German rocket scientists, men like Werner von Braun, and aim it at the stars. He was a man perfectly suited to the task. He was still the outsider, the ordnance man in a world of pilots and strategists. He fought the same battles he had fought in Normandy. He fought against institutional arrogance, this time from the Air Force and the Navy. He fought against flawed doctrine and by-the-book thinking. And he used the same skills. He saw the system, understood its inputs and outputs, and found the loopholes. When the Soviet Union stunned the world by launching Sputnik in 1957, the American system panicked. Its established programs were failing.
The Navy's Vanguard rocket exploded on the launch pad, a national humiliation. And in that moment of crisis, the nation turned, not to the established experts, but to the maverick, the ordnance man, the engineer who had a reputation for solving impossible problems. Medeiros, working with von Braun's team, did in 84 days what the rest of the American military-industrial complex could not. In January 1958, his rocket, a modified Redstone designated the Juno 1, successfully placed America's first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit. It was the perfect poetic echo of his life. The man who had defeated one German machine in France had gone on to build a new, better one with German minds in America. He had broken the stalemate in the hedgerows with a piece of psychological cunning. He broke the stalemate in the Cold War with a piece of brilliant engineering. He was never a hero in the traditional sense. He was something more modern and perhaps more dangerous. He was a systems analyst who had found his ultimate laboratory. The moral, then, is not simply that a good idea is better than a big gun. It is deeper than that. The lesson of the fake surrender, the enduring truth of Hill 192, is that discipline and doctrine, the very things that make an army strong, are also its most profound vulnerabilities. The German war machine in Normandy was a marvel of efficiency. It was disciplined, professional, and built upon a doctrine of defense that was perfectly suited to the terrain. It was, in its own way, a work of art. But its perfection was its flaw. It was predictable. It followed its own rules so rigidly that it could be manipulated. Medeiros did not defeat the German soldier. He defeated the German manual. He wrote a new line of code, the surrender paradox, and he fed it into the enemy's machine, causing it to fatally short-circuit. The established American doctrine was its own kind of flawed machine. It was a system built on brute force, on the arrogant belief that enough artillery and enough men could solve any problem. It was a doctrine that was chewing up its own soldiers because it could not or would not think. Men like Colonel McGregor were the high priests of this doctrine, men who valued the spirit of the fight over the reality of the battlefield. They saw Medeiros' idea as a moral failing because their system had no way to process it as a tactical virtue. Medeiros, the outsider, the man who was not a true infantryman, was the only one who could see both machines with perfect clarity. He was not blinded by the warrior ethos or the Fallschirmjäger myth. He saw only the gears, the levers, and the protocols, and he designed an exploit. The bluff was not an act of cowardice, it was an act of supreme intellectual aggression. It was a weapon that attacked the enemy's most valuable asset, his certainty. This is the full circle. The unauthorized idea, the piece of cheap trickery that was condemned as a crime against the spirit of warfare, is now a cornerstone of modern military doctrine. The lesson of Hill 192 was not lost, it was studied. The baffled intelligence officers, the ones who had to write the impossible after-action reports, eventually understood what had happened. They saw that a new frontier in warfare had been crossed. The psychological dimension of the battlefield, once the domain of propaganda leaflets and radio broadcasts, was now a place of tactical, lethal engagement. The art of the feint is as old as war itself.
But what Medeiros pioneered was something more specific, the art of the doctrinal feint. The idea of using an enemy's own standard operating procedures, his training, his very professionalism as a weapon against him. This is now a fundamental concept in military planning. It is taught to young lieutenants at West Point and to seasoned officers at the Command and General Staff College. It is called asymmetric warfare.
It is the core of special operations. It is the central idea behind cyber warfare. It is the art of finding the flaw in the enemy's system and turning it into a kill switch. Modern warfare is no longer just about fire and maneuver. It is about information and disinformation. It is about understanding an enemy's decision-making cycle and inserting a virus into it. The fake surrender was a virus. It forced the German NCOs on Hill 192 into a fatal, cascading logic failure. The ghost of that bluff lives on in every feigned retreat designed to lure an enemy into an ambush, in every faked radio transmission designed to draw an enemy out of position, in every cyber attack that uses an enemy's own security protocols to breach his network. The ungentlemanly trick of the ordnance colonel has been given a dozen new names: deception operation, perception management, information warfare. But the soul of the idea is the same. Do not attack the enemy's strength, attack his assumptions. Do not fight his army, fight his doctrine. The final brutal irony is that the American army, the institution that had scorned Medeiros' idea, would eventually become the world's foremost practitioner of it. The institution that had once seen warfare as a simple, honorable contest of wills now owned the most sophisticated psychological and deception-based arsenal in human history. The unauthorized idea did not just become a new tactic, it became the new paradigm. The hedgerow country of Normandy is quiet now. The green walls are still there, ancient and impassive. The pastures are filled with fat, placid cows. It is hard to imagine the violence that soaked this soil. But the battle fought here was not just for a hill. It was for an idea. The idea that the most effective weapon in any war is a precise and merciless understanding of the enemy's mind. It was an idea that was dismissed, condemned, and very nearly buried. And it was an idea so powerful, it would go on to change the very definition of the battlefield. The bluff was not just a trick to win a battle, it was a blueprint for the future of war.